Hello everyone, and welcome back to another ArcGIS Pro tutorial video. And in this tutorial video, I want to talk about dynamic feature labeling, which is probably the most common type of labeling that you're going to use in most map applications because it's fairly robust, easy to use, and offers a lot of really useful defaults for handling many labels at once. So what we did in the previous video is we used the graphic text to add one feature label to the dataset, Montauk Highway. And what I want to do here is I want to emphasize one more point about that before we move on, and that's that if I go back to the map view, so this is layout view, if I go back to the map view, you'll notice that we actually no longer have that label, and that's another aspect of graphic text, is that it only exists in layout view. So now let's talk about dynamic labeling. So dynamic labeling allows you to have labels generated by the data that are connected to the data, both in terms of the attributes that you choose to display for them, as well as the geographic location and scale of the data. So as you move the data around, as you zoom in and out and change the scale, the labels will change size and location along with it, which is extremely handy when you aren't exactly sure what the final scale and position of your data is going to be. So let's go ahead and just look at how that works by using the landmark feature. And one of the fields we're going to look at is called full name. So this full name is going to be the field that we're going to use to label our data. One thing I want to make you aware of is that if we sort by descending, you will notice that there are actually a lot of features in the landmarks dataset that actually don't have a name for us to place in the label. There are a couple of ways that we could do this. The first that we could do is we could just label it and forget about it. The second thing that we could do would be we could subset the data first using an attribute query and actually remove the data or create a second data layer for labels. Or we can use the built-in querying function in dynamic labeling to actually create a subset of the data in advance. And we're actually going to go with that last route because I think it best illustrates the power of using dynamic labeling as opposed to some of the other functionality in GIS. So in order to deal with dynamic labeling, what you're going to notice is that we can close the attribute table, is that as long as a feature layer, so points, lines, and polygons, as long as some sort of geometry is selected in the drawing order over here, highlighted in blue, you'll notice that along the top, we have an extra set of ribbons that are denoted as feature layer. And you'll notice that one of them is this labeling tab. So if you click this, you'll see that there are a lot of options here and that they're relevant to the idea that this is a point geometry. So it kind of already knows a little bit about the data that we're working with. So we're going to go from left to right. On the far left, this option here toggles the label on and off. So if I click it, you'll see that it is currently working. You can see the little spinning disc down here. It is working on producing the labels. It's going to take just a second. So because there was over 2,000 records in the attribute table and over 600 named records, you can see here that it took a minute, but we now have labels. The next thing we need to look at is classes. So classes are a function in dynamic labeling that allows us to create subsets of data so that we only label certain data with certain things. And we can manipulate these classes using queries. And this is what we're actually going to do to make sure that we're not trying to produce labels for those features that didn't have a full name. So what we can do here is if you click on SQL and you click on New Expression, this works just like the Select by Attribute does, except instead of dealing with selecting records to deal with selection, we're selecting records to deal with labeling. And so what we can do is we can do where full name is not equal to, and then we're going to put blank because again we want to select where they're not equal to blank. So if we apply that, right now, because of the way that we approach this, it actually won't look like anything has changed, even though it's taking a second to process the command. It's not going to look like anything has changed. But just to prove to you that this does work, I'm going to change the labeling to be is equal to, and then I'm going to pick one at random. How about Amityville? Now if I apply this, you'll see that it, if we zoom in here, you'll see that it actually only labeled the feature Amityville. So using SQL queries is a way to subset the data for labeling without having to subset the data in a selection. So you can have all of your data show up, but only label a certain subset of them. So this would be a really good feature if you have roads that maybe you have different road categories and you only want to label the major category. Or you can actually have multiple classes within the same feature, so you can control different types of labels in the same feature. So you could say maybe have highways be labeled one way, primary roads be labeled another way, and secondary roads be labeled a third way by creating multiple classes for each object. Working our way down, label field. This denotes which field you actually want to use for the label. So it sort of defaulted to our full name, but we could have just as easily chosen something like state FP, and you'll see here that it actually made 36. Or we could change it to, say, point ID, which is just the ID code for the point, not particularly useful. So again, this is the field that we use, this toggles the label on and off, and this allows us to use SQL to dynamically control what's getting labeled. Next is the visibility range. This allows us to control the zoom limits if we have dynamic zooming built into our map. So say, for example, we only wanted to be able to see this label between the scales of 1 to 200,000 and 1 to 300,000. So what we can do is it will actually select the minimum zoom at which the label is visible. So that means if we set 1 to 200,000 and 1 to 300,000, right, now it shows up for now. If I zoom in 1 to 627,000, you'll see that it's actually gone away, and if I zoom out beyond that, you'll see that it goes away again. So this can be really useful for controlling breakpoints if you have dynamic zooming. Gonna clear those limits. This is where we can do things like add information in terms of the font type, size, color. We can add halos, we can add all those kinds of text effects are done through the text symbol. So let's go ahead and add in let's make it slightly bigger and add in a halo of white. Click apply. Now, one thing I do want to point out with dynamic labeling is that you'll notice that as I zoom in and out, that the size of the text actually changes relative to the size of the feature to make it more readable or less readable. And that's one of the key distinctions of dynamic labeling, is you get that dynamism to allow you to dynamically change the size of the text. Okay, moving over to the right, label placement. This allows us to control where the labels are placed, and this is going to change relative to the geometry type. So if I click this so that we get all of the options, you can see we can do basic point, basic offset, or centered, and you'll see that it's changing the place. If we click this little box here, you'll see that we actually have a few more options. We can do orientation, we can do rotation, we can change buffers, so we can make things, we can change weights. This will allow us to control for overlap and competition between labels. If there are multiple labels, we can remove them. So say we had a road segment that had multiple pieces to it and each piece was being labeled, we could turn on remove duplicate labels to make it so that the duplicate labels no longer show up. So hopefully this makes sense. And just to prove to you something, if I switch to roads, you'll see here that the label placement options change and we have some more options in terms of how we place them. And then towns, because it's a polygon, it will update the placement options for polygons. So I know this was a lot. Hopefully these options are somewhat intuitive and all make sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.